On today's World Insight, a declaration from the world's 5 nuclear powers to head off nuclear conflict. Off to a good start? What's on the agenda?
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. For the very first time in history, the UN Security Council's 5 permanent members, also the world's 5 nuclear powers, have issued a joint statement on preventing nuclear war and avoiding an arms race. China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States signed the statement. It says a nuclear war must never be fought and nuclear weapons should only prevent war. They promise not to aim their nuclear weapons at each other or other countries. They also say it's important to address nuclear threats and respect the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The statement also stresses commitment to a key article in the treaty on full nuclear disarmament in the future. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres welcomed this joint statement. He looked forward to more details about the future initiative, saying the only way to eliminate all nuclear risks is to eliminate all nuclear weapons. Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Ma Zhaoxu explained the significance of the joint statement from the Chinese perspective. Do take a listen.
这是5国领导人首次
It's the first time that the leaders of the 5 countries issued a statement on nuclear weapons. It reflects the political will of the 5 states to prevent nuclear war and sends a shared voice for maintaining global strategic stability and reducing the risk of nuclear conflict. China has always advocated the concept that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. During the consultation process of the joint statement, China also promoted the inclusion of important elements such as reaffirming not targeting nuclear weapons at each other or any other state. This has played an important role in convincing the 5 nations to reach a positive and weighty statement. China will continue to contribute Chinese wisdom and propose Chinese solutions to promote global governance in the nuclear field, and is willing to cooperate with all peace-loving nations.
For the latest on the joint statement among the 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, we are joined by 2 of them, but we are hoping also to have 2 others coming from Russia and China joining us later. But for now, from Washington, D.C., Peter Kuznick, a professor of history at American University. Good to see you, Professor. In Paris, Paul Dorfman, an associate fellow of the Science Policy Research Unit of the University of Sussex. He is actually coming originally from the UK. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me. Now, the significance of it from your own perspective and your own countries. Professor Kuznick.
I think it is very significant that they issued this statement. It's an enormously positive statement, but it really reflects the minimum of sanity. I mean, anybody who thinks that a nuclear war is wageable and realistic is insane. I mean, we know from history and from all the studies we've done that to contemplate using nuclear weapons is to potentially raise the possibility of ending all life on the planet.
Okay.
We've run a lot of war games over the years about limited nuclear war, and they never seem to find an endpoint, which means that nuclear weapons open the door to possible annihilation on a global scale. The fact that we have these weapons, we say they're for deterrence, we say they're for defense, but the lesson that Kennedy and Khrushchev learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is that when one of these crises develops, then you lose control. They both lost control in 1962.
All right, got it. Message. I got your message, Professor, which is very straightforward. This, of course, is a positive step, but it's the minimum the 5 countries should do.
Yes,
and actually,
exactly,
they should do more. Let's hear also from Mr. Dorfman, coming from the UK.
Hello. Yes. Well, we are where we are. There are states with nuclear capability, and there are states without. This is a hugely encouraging step forward, where the key nuclear proponents have decided, multilaterally, to come together, to think together about the reality of we are. So it's a hugely encouraging step forward. And part of this, of course, is the question of attempting to delimit the nuclear military family. In other words, to try to stop proliferation of further nuclear military states.
Very interesting. Different messages certainly coming from Mr. Dorfman. It's a very encouraging step according to you, and it's a start of something new. Whether that is the trend that we want to see, let's also ask Professor Shending Li, Professor of the Institute of International Studies from Fudan University in China. Professor, good to see you. Your take?
Well, I think the P5 strive to provide confidence to the world that the P5 themselves are responsible country. They want to avoid nuclear war, and they want to prevent arms race. At a time of major power competition and rivalry, this provides a very fortunate, good message to the entire humankind.
Now, overall speaking, this is positive, but whether the countries who are signing on this joint statement will follow what they said, according to history, do we have any reference to refer to? Mr. Dorfman.
We live in a complex world, and at times it's no use oversimplifying complex realities. Currently, there are potential for conflict, but as our first speaker said, the notion of nuclear catastrophe is almost too horrific to countenance. However, there are such things as nuclear weapons, and on the face of it, following the last U.S. Administration, we have seen a relatively important increase in key states' nuclear capabilities, and largely all of the five powers have, to some extent, started to increase their capacity.
Right. Certainly, some of the recent years might not necessarily of very positive reference to all of us. Now, I'm also joined, I'm told by my producer, a guest coming from Russia, Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst coming from Russia. Mr. Sloboda, I want to have your comments from the Russian perspective about the latest joint statement.
Yes, from the perspective of the Russian government, this is, of course, a positive development. Russia had long pushed for this statement, particularly to get the words out of the United States. That is the official government perspective. On the ground, I think we have to realize as analysts that this changes nothing, either strategically or militarily. First of all, it only includes the P5 members, and we have, through nuclear proliferation, have many more armed nuclear powers today. Secondly, we have for years now been in a new arms race. This is still mostly qualitative rather than quantitative, but all of the major nuclear powers are, even as they sign it, modernizing their nuclear weapons, developing new types of launch vehicles, new types of warheads. The U.S. last year just deployed W-76-2, smaller, tactical, more usable nukes that military generals and planners argue that they need to use on the battlefield. They want to use them. So, I mean, this is a very nice boilerplate kumbaya statement. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that we are in a new, actually far more dangerous arms race, because it is an arms race not dictated by a bipolar world, but by a multipolar great power conflict with multiple nuclear armed states, right, all developing weapons that will vastly reduce launch and target time.
Mr. Sloboda, you touched on a very important point. That is, as the situations evolve, what worked, it seems, during the Cold War, for example, a gentleman's agreement between Russia, earlier former USSR, and the United States, will that work under the current circumstances? I think that's a big question many are asking. Professor Shen, your take.
Yes, I think there are many things which we can contemplate to do following the P5 statement. For instance, China-US already have an existing strategic nuclear warhead de-targeting agreement. How China-US can expand this bilateral paper to P5, I think it shall not be a great challenge. And how to reduce the warfighting readiness of each nuclear weapon power, which is also a discussable subject, and how we would entice all P5 members to no first use of nuclear weapon. And I think these are all discussable. This would make the P5 statement rich and substantial.
There are a lot of scenarios that the P5 should really handle. Professor Kuznick, to you, what are the most urgent ones? Some of them have already been mentioned by Professor Shen from Beijing, but what do you think are the priorities?
I think the priority is to defuse the most intense crises that we're facing now. You look at the U.S.-Russian and U.S.-Chinese relations are about the low point that they've been in 60 years or so, even longer perhaps. And there's certainly a risk of a military confrontation over Ukraine and over Taiwan. And this is getting worse, not better. Just yesterday, the EU's top diplomat, Joseph Borrell, visited the front lines in Ukraine to affirm EU support for the Zelensky government. Just yesterday, Taiwan had military drills to intercept Chinese planes in the event of a conflict over Taiwan. Just yesterday, North Korea tested ballistic missiles. We've got crises that are very, very imminent and palpable, and we've got to begin resolving them. I'm glad that the U.S. and Russia are going to be meeting on January 9th, and then followed by other meetings. I'm glad that the U.S. and China have been talking, but there's a lot of words. Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009 for a speech that he gave in Prague. But then what does he do? Then he calls for a 30-year trillion, now it's almost $2 trillion modernization of America's nuclear weapons. So as Mrs. Sloboda was saying before, this reality on the ground is very different than the verbiage. And that's what we have to reconcile.
Mr. Dorfman, it is not just the geopolitics, it is also politics within countries. We earlier, for example, the case of the United States, just during the Trump administration, withdrew from so many international treaties that really rang a bell to the international community about some of the earlier assumed possibilities are actually could be destroyed. So, Mr. Dorfman, with a lot of uncertainty, and that is just one of those examples in many countries. So can you help us to understand what do you think are the priorities?
It's clear that the Trump administration was a huge setback. And one can see to a certain extent the fallout from that. And in that sense, it mirrors exactly what strategic geopolitics means and does. And in that sense, if there are high-level agreements, if there are high-level attempts at bridging the gaps between nations and cultures, this to a certain extent configures something very hopeful. and something very positive. So in that sense, that's very helpful. But as our other discussants have said quite clearly, there are key problems that exist,
right,
and we are not in a safe position at present.
Gentlemen, stay with me for further discussions about this very important topic, the joint statement by the P5 of the Security Council members on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But there are many details that we need to discuss a bit later. We'll be right back. World Insight, live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei, and welcome back to our discussion. The joint statement by the Permanent Five of the Security Council of the United Nations certainly is a very encouraging message, but at the same time, there are a lot of details that really cause some caution. Peter Kuznick, Paul Dorfman, and Mark Slobodka, Shending Li, coming from 4 of the 5 countries, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, and also the United States of the Permanent Five, and they're sharing their insights with us. Gentlemen, welcome back. Let me ask you about another detail. If you look at the Permanent Five, yes, they're signing the joint statement, but there are many other possible nuclear weapon states that are not members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. For example, it is commonly believed and reported widely by the media, India, Pakistan, and possibly Israel as well. At the same time, Iran possibly on its way, and the DPRK, normally known as North Korea, withdrew from the NPT. So there are a lot of details that is not covered by this joint statement. What would that mean, Mr. Dorfman?
When one discusses nuclear risk, there's a sense of something that's uncontained, something that's almost unimaginable. So in that sense, trying to come to grips with this uncertainty, with the fact that there are other nuclear states that are not included within this discussion, as it were, is difficult to come to terms with. But that's part of where we are, how to deal with uncertainty, how to deal with indeterminacy, and how to make judgments about the risks that we all face. So I'm not here to pontificate about this. The question is, what does one do under conditions of uncertainty?
Mr. Slobodka, how do you think about the latest situation? There are much more details than what is being covered in the statement.
Yes, I mean, certainly when we're looking at Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea, all of these 4 states that have nuclear weapons or are widely presumed to have nuclear weapons, they are actually, because of the conflicts and tensions that each of them are involved in, are a very substantial risk of a conflict going nuclear. I mean, India and Pakistan is one of the most threatening ones. And that is not to downplay the threat of a Western Russian or Western Chinese conventional conflict going nuclear scenario. But we also, have the risk today, and a very real risk of nuclear terrorism, of non-state actors getting a hold.
Indeed.
And the risk of this increases as nuclear weapons proliferate, to, shall we say, countries with much less security or professional scruples than we have out of the P5.
Right. Professor Shen?
I think the P5 are setting examples for other countries, like what you mentioned, India, Pakistan, and Israel, etc. And while the P5 would set up their view, they would not wage nuclear war in an offensive way. They would only employ nuclear weapon for deterrence to prevent a war. And they believe even they use nuclear weapon for defense, they cannot win a war. We hope countries in India, in Israel, etc., would set up the same nuclear taboo. Even though they have certain nuclear weapons that may be viewed as illegitimate nuclear weapon. They should not contemplate to win a war through nuclear weapon. They should set up their own nuclear taboo, not to offend other countries, and also to prevent further nuclear proliferation, to join those P5 countries to make themselves very restrictive. Their weapons are only for deterrence.
On the other hand, Professor Kuznick, we see the world is changing. It's not just about nuclear or non-nuclear. It is also about many other directions, all at the same time. For example, we see more geopolitical groupings, such as AUKUS, Australia, the United States, the UK. Some suggest that could make Australia, which is a totally non-nuclear weapon country, having the possibilities of utilize the materials either required to make nuclear weapons. Now, of course, from utilization to making nuclear weapons, there's still a long way to go, but there is one possibility, and that possibly could set some kinds of precedents for the others also to follow. In other words, some worry that the Non-Proliferation Treaty could actually be broken as a result of all these negative possibilities. Now, Professor Kuznick, tell us briefly your analysis.
Well, we've lived with that possibility since we started developing peaceful atomic energy back in the 1950s, really. Eisenhower was warned when he announced Atoms for Peace at the UN in 1953 that this could lead to nuclear proliferation. The same situation now with Australia, as you mentioned, with the AUKUS agreement. So that's a real possibility, and others could use the precedent that the US and the UK established in the AUKUS deal with Australia in order to develop their own nuclear submarines. Why shouldn't Iran or other countries, why shouldn't China help Pakistan? I mean, this is a reality right now. But the main threat, again, is that the US and Russia have 91% of the world's nuclear weapons, and that other countries are expanding their arsenals. So so there is a threat of proliferation, but the real threat still remains with the major nuclear powers, the ones who issue this, in some ways, visionary statement, but it goes against the reality of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis.
Mr. Dorfman, briefly also from you, comments.
Yes, clearly AUKUS seems problematic insofar as that in the context of NPT, in legalistic terms, it seems okay to provide nuclear propulsion as opposed to nuclear weaponry and nuclear power. However, as our American colleague said, yes, it does seem problematic. Because states like Iran could then say, well, look, it's do like I say rather than do like I do, and it could have potential problematic repercussions in the Gulf region. That said, in the context of NPT, nuclear propulsion is far less dramatic than, say, new nuclear power, or certainly nuclear proliferation. And there are sort of safeguards associated with the AUKUS deal.
I see. Mr. Sloboda, briefly. Mr. Sloboda, please.
There is a problem with AUKUS, of course, in that, first of all, it is a new geopolitical grouping specifically designed to facilitate U.S. geopolitical containment of China. Giving Australia nuclear propulsion submarines.
We have some connection issues with Mr. Sloboda, but we do want to have Professor Shen to also has his words in this regard. briefly, Professor.
With AUKUS, Australia will be able to access to SSN, nuclear-powered attack submarine. Australia will possess nuclear reactor-level enriched uranium, which is more dangerous than the civilian nuclear power uranium, which is much closer to nuclear weapon grade level uranium. So this is not a nuclear weapon material, but it's more closer to nuclear weapon. That makes the world feel very disturbing.
We are having very limited time to tackle such an important and huge topic. As long as we know the specific NPT meeting has been postponed due to the Omicron virus and the pandemic issue, but it will be resumed later this week. We hope many of the issues that you gentlemen have touched on today will be further carefully discussed by all the participants then. Before we go, I want to briefly have every one of you, once again, a brief comments about what kind of uncertainties are we heading for in terms of the nuclear issue. Professor Kuznick, very briefly, you set a good example for all of us.
I think the world is recognizing that we're at a very dangerous moment. And the fact that they issued this statement now, despite the fact the NPT is not set to begin, we don't know when it's going to actually start. The fact that they issued a statement now is a very good sign that they realize that we're in a precarious moment and they want to ease the tensions, which is the right thing to do.
Mr. Dorfman from the UK.
It's a very good step forward. It's very encouraging. Let's hope that we can continue with this.
Professor Shen from China.
Reducing the role of nuclear weapon in national security and international security, that's the importance of this P5 statement.
We hope this statement will be an encouraging sign, as the Secretary-General of the United Nations said in his earlier statement, and it would also be an encouraging start for real further discussions about non-proliferation in a changing world. Thank you so much for all of you for your participation and your insights. Really appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.